A morning at the Cozy Kettle. The Cozy Kettle reeked pleasantly of cured pork and scorched joe, a familiar perfume etched into the very mortar of the place for decades. Sunlight, filtered by checked curtains, painted stripes across the room, spotlighting airborne dust swirling above worn red vinyl. The usual suspects occupied their favored spots: Martha from the bakery, meticulously applying butter to her toast; Tony the mechanic, glowering at newsprint while cradling a mug of black coffee; a covey of cackling retirees, buzzing with local gossip in their corner stronghold. Marco Rossi, a whirlwind of frantic energy, dodged between tables, his mumbled apologies vanishing in the din. Coffee, Martha. Refill, Tony? Just a sec, just a sec. Perpetual motion, perpetual stress. Today was no exception. Mrs. Gable, the proprietor, had leveled the look when he'd punched in, a mere 5 minutes behind schedule, and the breakfast frenzy was already peaking. His aspirations leaned towards a chic downtown bistro, but dreams lacked the power to settle bills, let alone conjure up 10 plates of scrambled eggs. He slammed a stack of hotcakes onto Tony's table, narrowly missing the edge of the paper. "Sorry, Tony. Didn't see you lurking there." A grunt was the only acknowledgement. Marco deflated slightly. Tony wasn't truly irate, just perpetually dour until his second caffeine fix. The bell above the entrance chimed, a welcome sound that generally sparked a glimmer of hope. Fresh business, a boosted tip jar. However, this time, it only amplified Marco's rising agitation. He glanced over, and his stomach plummeted. An elderly man stood near the doorway, clinging to a gnarled cane for support. He was spare of frame, almost fragile, crowned with a cloud of white hair, his eyes burdened with a sense of history. A faded army jacket, its insignia obscured by age, hung loosely on him. Marco's initial reaction was one of irritation. This would inevitably create delays. He'd need to find a suitable spot, offer assistance with the menu, and probably navigate a labyrinth of queries. Time he simply lacked. He forced a cheerful grin. "Morning. Table for one?" he inquired, struggling to mask his impatience. The man gave a slow nod, his gaze drifting across the bustling room. "Yes, just one," he replied, his voice raspy with age. Marco motioned dismissively towards a vacant booth in the rear. "Back there, by the window. Take your time." He spun back to the counter, muttering under his breath, "Just perfect." Mrs. Gable, seemingly equipped with radar, materialized by his side. "Marco," she said softly, but with steel in her tone. "Escort that gentleman to a table, and be courteous." Marco recalled slightly. "Yes, Mrs. Gable." He hastily returned to the man, who was struggling to negotiate the tight passageway. "Here, allow me." He grasped the man's arm, perhaps a touch too firmly, steering him toward the designated booth. A slight wince crossed the man's face as he settled into the seat, his movements measured and careful. Marco dropped a menu onto the surface. "Let me know when you're ready," he said, already halfway back to his station. He sensed Mrs. Gable's piercing gaze boring into his back. He recognized his own shortcomings. He knew he ought to demonstrate more patience, more compassion. But the incessant pressure, the relentless demands, consumed him. He made a mental note to return, offer an apology, perhaps a free cup of Java. But not yet. Not before he had caught up. Snatching his order pad, he whirled around, barking instructions at the cook, the image of the old man's weary expression already receding from his consciousness. The sizzling symphony of bacon and the clatter of silverware filled the space, eclipsing the quiet dignity of the newcomer seated in the corner. Hasty words. Marco juggled 3 plates, the ceramic biting into his sweaty palms. He risked a glance at Mrs. Gable, who stood sentinel near the pastry display, her gaze sharper than the glint of silver tongs. He had to impress her. Tonight was crucial. Come on, he muttered under his breath, weaving through the crowded tables. Table 6 was still lingering over their coffee, oblivious to the line of hungry patrons snaking towards the entrance. Seriously? You'd think they were carving Mount Rushmore out of that biscotti. He risked another glance, this time at Leo Maxwell, who was meticulously dabbing at a croissant crumb with his napkin. Leo's movements were slow, deliberate, each one a testament to a life lived with patience. Which, in Marco's opinion at that moment, was a luxury he couldn't afford. Ancient mariner, Marco hissed, thinking he was out of earshot as he darted behind the dividing wall, slowing down the whole operation. But the acoustics in the small cafe were treacherous. Leo, his hearing still sharp despite his years, looked up, his brow furrowed slightly. He caught the tail end of Marco's insult, the words hanging heavy in the air. A flicker of hurt crossed his face, quickly masked by a practiced neutrality. He'd heard worse, much worse, in places where the air reeked of gunpowder and death. Still, the casual cruelty stung. Marco, oblivious to the impact of his words, hurried towards the coffee station, grabbing a fresh carafe. He was so focused on speed that he misjudged the weight, the glass carafe slipping in his grasp. Hot, dark coffee cascaded over his hand and onto the pristine white counter. "Ugh," he yelped, dropping the carafe with a clatter that silenced the cafe. Mrs. Gable was at his side in an instant, her face a mask of disapproval. "Marco! What in heaven's name?" he stammered, trying to wipe the coffee from his hand with a damp cloth. I slipped, Mrs. Gable. It was an accident. An accident that could have scalded someone," she said, her voice tight. She surveyed the mess, the spilled coffee pooling on the floor. "Clean it up. Now. And try to be a little more aware of your surroundings. We pride ourselves on service here, Marco, not clumsiness." Humiliation burned hotter than the coffee on his skin. He scrubbed furiously at the spill, acutely aware of the eyes watching him. Leo Maxwell was among them, his expression unreadable. Marco avoided his gaze, shame washing over him. He knew he'd messed up, not just with the spill, but with his hasty words. He just hoped he hadn't ruined his chances with Mrs. Gable, and perhaps more importantly, with his own conscience. The cafe suddenly felt very small, and his mistake, very large. The senior discount. The scalding coffee soaked through Marco's apron and seared his skin. Mrs. Gable's voice, sharp as shattered glass, cut through the diner's usual morning din. "Marco. Honestly. What in the world were you thinking? That was going to Mrs. Henderson. You know she needs that to start her day." He mumbled an apology, grabbing a handful of napkins and desperately dabbing at the stain blooming across his shirt. The scent of burnt coffee hung heavy in the air, a constant reminder of his clumsiness. Mrs. Gable loomed over him, her disapproval radiating like heat from the grill. "Mr. Maxwell has been waiting patiently. See to him, and try not to spill anything else, Marco. This isn't a soup kitchen, we're running a business here, a respectable one." She turned sharply, her sensible shoes clicking against the linoleum as she marched back towards the kitchen, muttering about the cost of dry cleaning. Marco, his face burning hotter than the spilled coffee, stomped over to Leo's booth. The old man sat quietly, observing the chaos with unnervingly calm eyes. Marco slammed the order pad onto the table. "All right, Pops," he snapped, the words laced with a bitterness he couldn't quite suppress. "What'll it be? I suppose I should offer you the senior discount, seeing as you're practically fossilized." The words flew out before he could stop them, a knee-jerk reaction to Mrs. Gable's reprimand and the overall pressure of the morning. He immediately regretted it. Leo didn't flinch. He simply looked up, his blue eyes, usually twinkling with a quiet amusement, now clouded with a faint sadness. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable. Marco shifted his weight, the soggy apron clinging unpleasantly to his legs. Finally, Leo spoke, his voice soft but clear. "Just toast, please. And a cup of tea. Earl Grey, if you have it." Marco scribbled down the order, avoiding Leo's gaze. "Anything else? Maybe a prune juice to help things along." He winced internally. Why couldn't he just shut up? Leo shook his head gently. "That will be all, thank you." Marco spun on his heel and marched back to the kitchen, the weight of his words settling heavily in his stomach. He could feel Leo's eyes on his back. He felt small and mean. He placed the order with Maria, the cook, and tried to busy himself wiping down the counter, but the image of Leo's sad eyes lingered. The aroma of freshly baked bread usually filled him with a sense of comfort, but today it only amplified his guilt. He knew, deep down, that he had crossed a line. A line he desperately wished he could uncross. Flickers of recognition. Leo meticulously chewed his toast, finding a meager solace in its coarse texture against the acrid residue of Marco's words. The lukewarm tea offered little comfort against the creeping coldness within him. The diner, typically a comforting symphony of clattering and hushed voices, felt abrasive today, each sound an unwanted intrusion. Marco, a jittery current of perpetual motion, hurried past with a teetering tower of dishes, avoiding Leo's gaze. Behind the counter, Mrs. Gable, perched like a watchful bird, observed everything with an inscrutable expression. A news flash on the overhead screen snagged Leo's attention. Brenda Sterling's gleaming smile, a beacon of manufactured cheer, felt jarring against the diner's time-worn aesthetic. And this evening, we salute a true hometown hero, Mr. Arthur Penhaligon, for his remarkable service in World War II. Brenda's voice, amplified to a nasal drone, sliced through the diner's ambience. Mr. Penhaligon, a D-Day veteran, has dedicated his life to this community since his return. The camera shifted to an elderly gentleman, ramrod straight despite his years, his chest adorned with the luminous medals of valor. His eyes, kind and deep-set, were framed by a roadmap of wrinkles earned through hardship and time. He possessed a quiet dignity that radiated outwards. Leo watched, his own pale reflection superimposed on the image. The segment transitioned to archival footage, faded photographs of young men in uniform, their faces etched with both trepidation and resolve. A nameless feeling tugged at Leo, a fleeting memory just beyond his grasp. Marco, for a heartbeat still, stood by the coffee dispenser, his shoulders bowed, his back a study in defeat. Mrs. Gable, hands clasped before her, appeared rapt, her focus solely on the television. Brenda Sterling's voice, thick with admiration, continued, "Mr. Penhaligon will be presented with the key to the city in a ceremony tomorrow afternoon." The report continued, recounting Mr. Penhaligon's selfless contributions after the war, countless hours of volunteer work, fundraising for the local medical center, guiding at-risk youth. Each achievement painted a vibrant portrait of a man who had given everything. Leo finished his tea, the bitter aftertaste unnoticed. He glanced at Marco again, an unspoken question hanging between them like a shroud. The waiter remained frozen, a monument to guilt and remorse. Mrs. Gable levered herself off her stool and moved toward the kitchen, her steps echoing on the black and white tiles. The news segment dissolved into a commercial for bargain basement car insurance, the screen now populated with impossibly happy, smiling consumers. The diner seemed to compress, the air heavy with secrets and the crushing weight of a mistake. An unlikely hero. Marco spun, nearly clipping Mrs. Gable with a tray laden with steaming plates of lasagna. Sorry, he muttered, his voice tight with frayed nerves. He dodged a busboy and nearly collided with Leo again, who was patiently waiting for his water glass to be refilled. "Just a sec, old-timer," Marco snapped, then winced internally. He was officially losing it. Mrs. Gable, who had been meticulously arranging silverware at a freshly set table, stopped and fixed Marco with a gaze that could curdle milk. "Marco, is everything all right? You seem agitated." Before Marco could stammer out an excuse, the lunchtime news broadcast blared from the small television perched above the bar. He usually ignored it, but a familiar black and white image flickered across the screen, arresting his attention. "Finally, tonight we honor the bravery of Sergeant Leo Maxwell, recently awarded the Silver Star for his extraordinary heroism during the Battle of the Bulge. Sergeant Maxwell, presumed dead for decades, was instrumental in." The grainy footage showed a younger Leo, impossibly lean and fierce-looking, leading a charge across a snow-covered field, the air thick with smoke and the staccato bursts of gunfire. A narrator's voice, somber and respectful, recounted the details, Maxwell, single-handedly disabling a German tank, saving his entire platoon from certain annihilation. Maxwell, dragging wounded comrades to safety under relentless enemy fire. Mrs. Gable gasped, her hand flying to her chest. Leo, she whispered, her eyes glued to the screen. She turned sharply to face the man sitting quietly at table 7, his face etched with the same quiet dignity she now recognized from the news footage. That's you, isn't it? Leo looked up, a flicker of something, perhaps sadness, perhaps resignation, crossing his face. He nodded slowly. It was a long time ago, Patricia. The news report continued, showing more archival footage, Maxwell receiving a Purple Heart, Maxwell shaking hands with a general, Maxwell's name being read aloud at a memorial service for the fallen. Marco stood frozen, the tray in his hand trembling. He felt a cold dread creep up his spine. The old-timer he'd just dismissed, the man he'd been so rude to, was a war hero? A man who had faced unimaginable horrors and emerged, somehow, with his quiet dignity intact. He stared at the television, then back at Leo, then back at the television again. The image on the screen shifted to a recent photograph of Leo, looking older, yes, but with the same piercing blue eyes and the same resolute set to his jaw. The caption read, "Sergeant Maxwell, a nation's gratitude." Marco's mouth went dry. He lowered the tray, the clatter of the plates echoing in the sudden silence of the restaurant. Mrs. Gable was already moving towards Leo, her face a mixture of awe and concern. "Sergeant Maxwell," she said, her voice trembling slightly. I had no idea." She reached out and gently took his hand. "Welcome to Gable's. Anything you need, anything at all, is yours." Marco watched, paralyzed by shame and disbelief. He had insulted a hero. And Mrs. Gable, his usually stern and pragmatic boss, was treating him with a deference she usually reserved for visiting dignitaries. The weight of his actions crashed down on him. He had to apologize. But how could he possibly find the words? The weight of regret. The clatter of plates usually soothed Marco, a rhythmic percussion against the chaos of the dinner rush. Tonight, it was a discordant symphony of shame. Each dropped fork, each spilled drink, echoed the lead weight settling in his stomach. He kept replaying the scene with the old man, Leo Maxwell, the dismissive wave, the impatient sigh. He'd treated a decorated veteran like just another demanding tourist. Marco scrubbed furiously at a non-existent stain on the countertop, his reflection staring back at him, a mask of tight-lipped anxiety. He'd seen the medals, the glint of silver catching the light as Leo adjusted his jacket. He'd registered the quiet dignity in the man's eyes, the way he carried himself. And he'd still been rude. He had to apologize. The thought propelled him out of the busier station and toward table 7. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drummer keeping pace with his guilt. Leo sat alone, nursing a glass of water, his gaze fixed on something beyond the restaurant window. The evening light painted the lines on his face in sharp relief, each wrinkle a testament to a life lived, battles fought, and sacrifices made. "Mr. Maxwell?" Marco's voice cracked, betraying his nervousness. Leo slowly turned, his eyes, the color of faded denim, regarding Marco with a patient, almost weary expression. There was no anger there, no fire, just sadness. And that was somehow worse than any yelling could have been. "Sir," Marco stammered, wiping sweaty palms on his apron. I wanted to apologize. For earlier. My behavior was unacceptable. I was stressed, but that's no excuse. I didn't realize," he trailed off, the words catching in his throat, a tangled mess of regret. He wanted to explain, to justify his actions, to somehow lessen the blow of his disrespect. But there were no excuses. He had been wrong, plain and simple. It's all right," Leo said softly, waving a hand dismissively. His voice was raspy, like dry leaves rustling in the wind. "Don't worry about it." But Marco did worry. He saw past the polite dismissal, glimpsed the hurt lurking behind Leo's calm facade. He had wounded this man, however inadvertently, and the knowledge was a bitter pill. "Please, sir. Let me get you something. Dessert on the house? Anything." Leo shook his head, a faint smile playing on his lips. "No, thank you. I'm just remembering." Seems like a long time ago. His gaze drifted back to the window, unfocused, lost in the labyrinth of his memories. The sounds of the bustling restaurant faded around him, replaced by the echoes of distant gunfire, the faces of fallen comrades, the weight of duty and sacrifice. Marco was no longer there, no longer relevant. Marco stood there for a moment longer, feeling utterly useless, the weight of his regret crushing him. He mumbled another apology, unanswered, before retreating back to the perceived safety of the kitchen, the clatter of plates now a relentless, accusing chorus. A diner's shame. Mrs. Gable's face was a thundercloud. She marched towards Leo's table, her sturdy shoes clicking sharply on the linoleum floor. Marco watched, stomach churning, as she approached the veteran, who was now calmly stirring sugar into his tea. "Mr. Maxwell," she began, her voice low but carrying across the near-silent diner. "I am so sorry." Marco's behavior was completely unacceptable. He's been under a lot of pressure lately, but that's no excuse. No excuse at all. Leo looked up, his eyes, the same shade as a washed-out denim jacket, meeting hers. He didn't seem angry, just tired. "It's all right, Mrs. Gable. Happens to the best of us." "It is not all right," she insisted, her gaze softening slightly. "You served our country, Mr. Maxwell. You deserve respect, not that." She gestured vaguely in Marco's direction, her lips pursed. "Please, let me offer you a full meal, on the house. Anything you want. And a slice of my apple pie. It's fresh out of the oven." The aroma of cinnamon and baked apples wafted from the kitchen, a comforting scent against the awkwardness. Leo chuckled, a low rumble in his chest. "Well, I never turn down apple pie. Especially if it's yours, Patricia. But really, the tea is fine." "Nonsense," Mrs. Gable said, waving her hand dismissively. "Consider it a small token of our appreciation. And my sincere apology." She gave his hand a quick, firm squeeze before turning back to Marco, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "Get him whatever he wants, Marco. And you be respectful." Marco, mortified, nodded silently. He watched Mrs. Gable return to the counter, her shoulders still rigid with disapproval. He knew he'd disappointed her, and that stung more than any reprimand. He crept back to Leo's table, his heart pounding against his ribs. The fluorescent lights of the diner seemed to amplify his shame. He picked up the tea kettle, refilling Leo's cup with trembling hands. "More tea, Mr. Maxwell," he mumbled, avoiding eye contact. Leo nodded, watching him with an unreadable expression. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable. Marco grabbed a plate and scurried to the pastry display, returning with a blueberry muffin, warm from the oven. He placed it on the table, next to Leo's plate. "Mrs. Gable makes these fresh every morning," Marco offered, the words catching in his throat. They're good." He quickly retreated to the relative safety of the counter, feeling the weight of Leo's gaze on his back. He knew a muffin and a refill wouldn't erase his earlier behavior, but maybe, just maybe, it was a start. The guilt was a bitter taste in his mouth, worse than any burnt coffee. He needed to do better. He would do better. A glimmer of forgiveness. Marco hovered, a nervous hummingbird trapped in a bell jar. He'd replaced the spilled coffee, offered a profuse apology to Mrs. Henderson who, bless her heart, had patted his hand and said, "Accidents happen, dear," and even managed to bus a few tables without shattering any more glassware. But Leo Maxwell. He was the linchpin. He held out the blueberry muffin, still warm from the oven, on a pristine napkin. "Mr. Maxwell, I really am sorry about earlier. It was completely unprofessional of me. I haven't been myself today." The explanation felt flimsy, even to his own ears. He wasn't sure what he expected, maybe a dressing down, maybe to be ignored completely. What he didn't expect was the profound sense of shame churning in his gut. He risked a glance at the older man's face. Leo was meticulously folding his napkin, his movement slow and deliberate, as if performing a sacred ritual. He looked up, his eyes, usually sharp and assessing, now held a surprising softness. Marco saw past the stern exterior, the faint lines etched around his eyes telling tales of battles fought and seen. He saw weariness, yes, but also understanding. The restaurant noise faded, the clatter of silverware, the murmur of conversations, all receding into a distant hum. In that moment, it was just Marco, trembling slightly, and Leo, holding his gaze. Leo's silence stretched, thick and heavy. Marco's stomach clenched. He wanted to bolt, to disappear into the bustling kitchen and never face the consequences of his outburst. But he stood his ground, offering the muffin like a peace offering, a symbol of his regret. Then, something shifted. A flicker of something akin to amusement danced in Leo's eyes. He stopped folding the napkin and reached out, his hand steady despite its age. He took the muffin, his fingers brushing against Marco's. "Thank you, son," he said, his voice a low rumble, the anger from before completely absent. He paused, then added, a ghost of a smile playing on his lips, "Blueberry's my favorite." He brought the muffin to his mouth, took a bite, and closed his eyes for a brief moment. Marco held his breath, waiting, judging. Leo opened his eyes again, the corner of his mouth tilting upwards in a genuine, albeit small, smile. It wasn't a grand, sweeping gesture of forgiveness, but it was there. A glimmer. Marco felt a wave of relief so intense it almost buckled his knees. The knot in his chest loosened, the frantic energy that had been coursing through him began to dissipate. The world seemed to sharpen, the colors of the restaurant becoming more vibrant, the sounds of the diners less jarring. He straightened his shoulders, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. He still had tables to serve, orders to take, but now he had something else too, a reason to do better. Leo Maxwell's quiet acceptance, that small, almost imperceptible smile, had given him a second chance, not just with a customer, but with himself. He would not squander it. He wouldn't let the pressure of the day, the ghosts of his own anxieties, dictate his behavior. He would be better. He had to be. The kettle's new heart. Marco attacked the stubborn coffee stain, the harsh fumes of the cleanser prickling his nostrils. The cozy kettle, silent now, held only echoes of the dinner rush. Yet, despite the quiet, Leo Maxwell's disappointed, almost pitying expression played on repeat behind Marco's closed eyelids. He squeezed tighter, but the image remained, an accusation. He'd come dangerously close to wrecking everything. Not just his livelihood, but the delicate harmony Mrs. Gable had so carefully nurtured within these walls. A sanctuary where the scent of cinnamon intertwined with the light-hearted banter of friends, familial whispers, and the quiet contentment of those seeking solace in warmth and sweetness. And he'd nearly soured it all with his own bad attitude. He flung the rag into the sink, the sound amplified in the stillness. Never again. He couldn't afford to. He owed a debt to Mrs. Gable, to Leo Maxwell, and most of all, to himself, to evolve. To strive for betterment. He forged a silent resolution, amidst the lingering aroma of coffee and remorse. Each patron, from the grumpiest morning grouch to the most demanding evening arrival, would be met with generosity, understanding, and respect. He would listen, truly listen, to their requests, their narratives, their burdens. He would transform into an emblem of optimism, a heartening, welcoming presence at the cozy kettle's vibrant center. The following day, Marco was there before dawn, invigorated. He brewed Mrs. Gable's special blend, its fragrant promise weaving through the air. He buffed the counter until it shone, each pass a silent pledge renewed. Mr. Henderson, a retired schoolteacher notorious for his fastidious habits and even more exacting complaints, was the first to arrive. Marco steeled himself, forcing a smile. "Good morning, Mr. Henderson," he greeted, his voice deliberately upbeat. The usual black coffee and blueberry muffin. Mr. Henderson blinked, clearly surprised by the greeting. "Yes, well, be certain the muffin isn't too friable this time," he grumbled, a flicker of astonishment in his gaze. Marco presented the order with a genuine smile, drawing Mr. Henderson into a brief discussion about the local cricket team's prospects. He even remembered the extra sugar packet, just as Mr. Henderson preferred, without being prompted. As the hours unfolded, Marco's resolve faced trial by fire. A frazzled mother wrestling with unruly children, a tourist grappling with the intricacies of the menu, a teenager seemingly welded to his phone, each interaction was met with unwavering patience and a sincere desire to assist. He offered the mother a complimentary cookie to appease her children, painstakingly deciphered the menu for the tourist, and even elicited a reluctant grin from the morose teenager. A newfound energy pulsed through the cozy kettle that day. It transcended the mere clatter of crockery and the murmur of voices. It was a palpable sense of connection and goodwill. Customers lingered longer, conversing with one another, trading stories and laughter. The atmosphere felt buoyant, luminous, steeped in a spirit of community. Even Leo Maxwell appeared changed. His sharp gaze still missed nothing, but a glint of amusement danced in his eyes, a subtle nod of approval that sent a wave of relief surging through Marco. That evening, Mrs. Gable squeezed Marco's shoulder, her eyes sparkling. "You know, Marco," she said, her voice gentle yet firm, "sometimes, a little kindness is all it takes to reshape the world." Marco smiled, a genuine, heartfelt smile that lit his entire face. He finally understood. The cozy kettle was more than a place to pour coffee and sell pastries, it was a haven to offer kindness, empathy, and a sense of belonging. And he, Marco Rossi, was finally ready to embrace his role.